All right, today we're going to be talking about why Afflicted sucks. In general, I think Blizzard does a pretty good job of designing the spell mechanics in dungeons. I think that the spell mechanics are typically used in an okay manner for healers in general, and it makes sense. You know, there are a lot of times like on bosses. I'm thinking like the first boss of Fall, where the heal absorb gets healed off by the tank, and then the healer then dispels the tank. Toxic or the bloom from the time stream anomalies in both Rise and Fall. You know, you have to dispel that mechanic, and sometimes you actually just have to dispel it fast in the instance of that. But I think in typical fashion, Blizzard does an okay job of designing dispel mechanics. Typically, dispels are used as just ways to prevent damage. Like you see in Everbloom here, the stingers go on to players. You dispel that off, and you take a little bit less damage. And that's the most typical situation for dispel mechanics. However, there are some magic dispel mechanics that are healer only. Now, there are situations, and we're going to be talking about why Afflicted sucks. There are some situations where your dispel is mandatory, like the bloom, right? Where your healer is not going to have a situation, or the chrono stream debuff on manifest time waste. That's also another good one where you have to dispel somebody immediately. Where your dispel is occupied by something else, right? And you're not going to have the ability to be able to dispel what you have to as a mechanic in the dungeon and the Afflicted itself. And that's why Afflicted is bad, and this is what we're going to kind of be talking about today. So, Afflicted, whenever they come out, I want to say they have an 8-second cast, or maybe it's a 9-second cast. It's enough to where you're able to dispel both Afflicted with one dispel. If you dispel it like the first millisecond it comes out, right? Then it allows you to dispel it a second time. However, on a more practical level, that's not realistic to happen. And so the best way of dealing with Afflicted is by designing a composition that has a bunch of dispels in the composition, right? So whenever you look at the front page of Raider right now, typically it has about 3 hybrid DPS. There's some compositions like you see right here that have 4, right? They have Prot Paladin, and then they have like their healer. I guess they have 3, but they have 3 plus a healer, right? So, and there are a lot of times that there will be a composition that will have, 3 or 4. I think that 3 is the more typical amount for a lot of compositions that run with like a Vengeance Demon Hunter. But say if you play with a Prot Paladin, a lot of the times this season you're going to have 4 if you're playing like a super meta comp. Now the question happens as to what happens when you're playing not what the people on the front page of Raider.io are playing, and instead you're playing with your friends, or say you're playing a composition that you think is actually quite good, but there are some specializations that just don't have a dispel for it. And so that kind of leads you in a weird spot, and this is kind of what we're going to talk about today about why Afflicted is bad. So since Afflicted occupies so many of your dispels just generally, they come out every 30 seconds. They require at most 2 dispels, a minimum of 1. Sometimes people, specifically Augvoker, can get both of them if they have Cauterize available. If they also dispel immediately, they have a little bit more leeway than other specializations, so there's sometimes that they can also get 2. And alternatively, you can heal it back up. Now, in a real-world situation, nobody's healing the Afflicted. I think that there are very few Afflicted that are healed. Now, it does happen, but I would say it is very few and far between, and if you play any practical level of Mythic Plus, that's not something that you are likely to see, is anybody healing the Afflicted up, unless they know in advance that that is the only way that they're able to deal with it. And the reason that they don't heal it up is because more often than not, you're actually having to heal damage that's occurring in the pack, right? So healing Afflicted is going to take 3 to 4 globals, whenever a dispel on average is going to only take you like 1. And so it kind of makes sense. And so then whenever you're designing a composition, having to have this in mind whenever you're actually creating a composition for Afflicted, it sucks, right? And so if you look at this composition right here, they actually have they're playing with a Demonology Warlock. So say your group starts off and you actually have a Demonology Warlock, right? And so the Demonology Warlock and the Vengeance Demon Hunter are friends. Okay, so these are 2 people without a spell. And then they invite the Restoration Druid. And then they invite an Augvoker because somebody thinks Augvoker is good, right? And so now you have 2 dispels. And so then somebody is like, oh, I know a very good Havoc Demon Hunter, right? So say they don't play with a mage in this composition. Say instead they play with a Havoc Demon. Oh, I know a very good Havoc Demon Hunter. Then they have 3 classes without a dispel at all. And so that leaves only 2 people with dispel. And so that leaves you in a weird situation where the only 2 people who are able to deal with Afflicted in the entire run are the Augvoker and the Rest Druid in that instance, right? And so that leaves you in a position where it is a very high degree of likelihood, unless the Augurbroker and the Rest Druid are the best players you've ever seen in your entire life. Multiple Afflicted are going off in that run and giving you a 50% haste penalty. Now, a 50% haste penalty is, I would argue, maybe a bit too high. And this might be the issue with Afflicted, but I think the issue with Afflicted is ultimately the fact that it takes your Dispel, and I think that that's the cringe part of Afflicted. But the fact that the penalty for messing up an Afflicted is a 50% haste reduction, and a lot of times in like high keys, this is going to cause you to wipe. Now, I know this isn't necessarily super common for like a large majority of the player base, but taking a 50% haste reduction, there are a lot of situations where that just kills your tank almost immediately. Or if you have, you know, like a debuff from like a trash mob, that can kill you off like almost instantly if you're taking a 50% haste reduction, because your healer's not going to be able to heal with 50% haste reduction. And so say that you're playing that composition, you have to have your dispels done perfectly for the entire run. And so that's kind of why Afflicted is bad, is because whenever you like tackle in the issues that occur inside of the dungeon, right? The dispels that are present inside of the key, then Afflicted becomes a problem if you don't have enough hybrids. And this becomes an issue whenever you're creating and crafting the group composition, is you need to make sure that you're making a composition that works perfectly with Afflicted. And I think that that gives too much agency to the affix itself. I think that in Blizzard themselves called Afflicted a passenger affix, right? And the problem with the affix is that the range and difficulty depends solely on your class composition. And I agree with this. And I think that having played it this week, I'm even more annoyed about Afflicted. And that's kind of why I'm making this video again. Talk about the back of being sick with COVID, but I've decided that Afflicted has annoyed me enough. And so, yeah, it ranges from trivial difficulty to that has a large punishment for failure. But the range is like, again, from trivial to very, very difficult. So say you're playing with like, you know, an enhancement shaman as well, or say you have like a shaman in general. Shaman is actually probably the best class for dealing with Afflicted. They just drop poison cleansing totem for every other Afflicted set, and they dispel both of them by themselves. That owns. That's sick utility. However, not every class has a dispel, right? So say you're playing with a warlock or whatever, and they don't have a dispel. Say you're playing with a rogue, they don't have a dispel. A havoc demon hunter, they don't have a dispel. Any tank that's not a hybrid, right? You're playing with a vengeance, you're playing with a warrior, you're playing with a DK, they don't have a dispel. And so that it just makes Afflicted to be such a problem affix. And I think the punishment level is honestly just far too high. But at the same point as well, like, it's not about necessarily the punishment level, it's about how it interacts with the keys. And I also think that this article actually does a really good job of summarizing it. They basically say, in addition to this, Afflicted just feels like it happens so often, it has a chance of spawning every 30 seconds, which means you can deal with up to 60 sets in a 30-minute dungeon. And that happens, you know, over the course of a dungeon, and more often than not, it doesn't really matter. But the ones that do matter are the ones that kind of create these overlaps with, like, oh, my healer dispel is on CD. It spawned off a player that's like 60 yards away, and we didn't see it, right? Sometimes it'll spawn, if you're in Waycrest Man and you're like downstairs, it'll spawn like on a wall, and your camera sucks, and you're like, oh, great. Without a weak aura, I couldn't even tell that it was spawning there. That just seems so non-intuitive. Like, that's so bad. And basically, I agree with this. I don't think this affix has worked out as intended, and I think it's personally harmful to the community perception that classes don't have a dispel do not feel useful this week. If I was honestly a class that didn't have a dispel, you know what I would do? Probably turn off my friendly nameplates. I don't give a fuck about Afflicted. I'm just blasting music as loud as I possibly can. POV, I'm a demon hunter. And basically, so what the end of this says is this affix is just doubling down that are on excluding classes that were already not incentivized to be brought. And I think that this is a problem. I think that this means that the affix is probably either too punishing, or it creates too much of a problem inside of the Mythic Plus dungeon itself. Again, nobody's healing Afflicted. Imagine if an affix took your interrupt on a pack occasionally. More often than not, this probably wouldn't matter. Not every pack has a lot of interrupts that are super mandatory, but on the packs that it does matter, say it took your interrupt, it would probably wipe you if it depending on the scale of the punishment level. Right? That would be stupid. Nobody would be happy with it. The same thing happens with dispels. This is a dumb mechanic. I don't like Afflicted. I think it's not very fun. And I don't think that Blizzard should be looking at this and be like, oh, it's because the punishment level is too high. I think they should be looking at it, it's like the way that dispel mechanics are done in dungeons is normally fine, in my opinion. I don't necessarily have issues with dispel mechanics in Mythic Plus in general. I have issues with Dispel mechanics, with how it interacts with Afflicted, and it's just the Afflicted mobs. But yeah, those are my thoughts on why Afflicted sucks. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys later. Goodbye.